Before we get into today's episode, I want to share something that's helped transform my daily routine. I've started using Bob, the refillable bottle-free body wash designed specifically for men. If you're still using bottled shower gel, you're literally washing money down the drain. Let's face it, you always use more than you need and half of it just slips through your hands before it touches your skin. Bob combines a reusable applicator with exfoliating bristles and the world's first refillable body wash bars, formulated to match a man's skin pH of 5.5. All this means you get a deep clean with zero wastage. It's better for your skin, better for your wallet, and better for the planet. Plus, it's travel proof. Just pop on the lid and your Bob is ready to go wherever you are. For an exclusive 15% offer on your first order, head over to welcometobob.com and use the code meaningofmen15 at checkout. Welcome back to The Meaning of Men, the show dedicated to helping men find meaning, purpose, and resilience in their lives. I'm your host, Simeon Atkins, and today we're diving into one of the most misunderstood emotions we experience, anger. I'm joined by journalist and author Sam Parker, whose new book, Good Anger, explores how this powerful emotion can be a force for good, if we learn how to understand and work with it. We talk about why anger has such a bad reputation, especially among men, and how it's often mistaken for aggression or violence. We explore how anger expressed in the right way helps us defend boundaries, name unmet needs, and even express self-love. We also talk about how anger plays out in relationships, online, and across different identities, and how small daily habits can help us build a better relationship. This episode is about reclaiming anger as something that can connect us more deeply to ourselves and others, not something to fear or suppress. Let's get into it. Sam, for anyone that's just tuning in, what would you like them to take away from our conversation today?
I think a deeper curiosity about anger, both how that plays out in society, but also for them themselves. I think the first step to having a better relationship with anger is just to be really curious about what it's actually there for, what it has to tell us, and in time maybe even learn to kind of value, if not enjoy, anger a little bit.
Yeah, anger is, to me, it feels like one of these red button topics where I think people have probably already got their own preconceived notions of what anger's about, and maybe a topic they don't necessarily want to dive into, and they've put it in a box in terms of what they understand around anger. So I love what you said there about having a deeper curiosity and a deeper understanding ultimately about it, which we'll certainly go into during the conversation. Before we dive in, give us a better idea of who you are and ultimately the journey that's led you on the path to where you are today, writing a book all about anger.
Sure. So I've been a journalist and an editor for about just under 20 years now. I've always worked in magazines and newspapers in the UK. I had a fairly typical upbringing in the northeast of England, came from a very loving and stable home, but nevertheless, like millions of other people, didn't develop a very healthy relationship with anger, often found it overwhelming in my teens. From that, learned that probably the safest way to deal with it was to repress it, which in time led to suppression. So I was doing it without realizing I was doing it. I would say that I spent the first 15 years or so of my career very much as a people pleaser, someone who is very conflict avoidant. It wasn't a deliberate tactic because our personas generally aren't, but the way I tried to go through life, my career, was to keep people happy, to avoid getting into confrontations, to try and always be super positive about everything, which can be great skills, but ultimately wasn't enough on its own. And so when this book began was when I encountered a situation in my career where that mode of being, of trying to keep everybody happy, stopped working for me, and I actually needed to defend myself. And without going into too much detail, I kind of had a bad year. I think a lot of books come out of a bad year, right? And my bad year was a lot of anxiety, a lot of depression. And the story I tell in the book is that I tried to address this by finding ways to calm down, to feel more peace. And so I tried meditation and jogging and gratitude journaling and, cold showers and all of these things that I'd found by looking at the wellness industry. None of which are bad things, by the way. They just didn't work for me. I couldn't really shake off this feeling of anxiety that I had kind of every day, this dread and gloom about things. And then one day I was boxing, which isn't something I had ever done before, had much interest in, but I decided to try it because I was trying a lot of things at that time. And one day I was at the boxing bag, and I tell this story in the book. I was kind of going about my routine, plodding along, as I was at that time. And I started to feel this sort of surge of energy. And I was kind of boxing away and feeling really powerful and big and wide and strong and kind of kept going for ages. And when I stopped, I kind of realized that I didn't feel sad or anxious. I actually felt really angry. And as I sort of luxuriated in this angry feeling, I kind of felt like I could take the world on. All my problems became targets rather than obstacles. I could hear the conversations I needed to have with people in my head kind of unfurling really crisply and clearly. And so I was sort of in this really powerful anger feeling, and I thought to myself, you've always sort of described yourself as someone who never gets angry. And I'd always thought of anger as a sort of nuisance emotion until that point. But yet here it is making me feel better than I had for months. And so I followed that thread and decided to come at it like I had other subjects as a journalist, just by starting again, trying to put my preconceptions to one side. I start from the beginning, really, with what is anger? What's it for? Can it be a good thing? Clearly, it can be a bad thing. We see that all around the world and often in our own lives, but can it be a good thing? And so that was the beginning of the journey into writing the book. Yeah, it's been a life-changing experience, really.
And the book Good Anger, I'd love to dive into where that title really came from, what you mean by good anger, and from the research that you did, how you see it differing from how we typically understand anger.
So, good anger is when it enhances our life, when we act on it in a way that is proportionate, calm, effective, and ultimately leaves us in a better position than we were before. Now, that could be a frank conversation with somebody who has upset you. It could be taking the energy that you feel in your body and in your mind and channeling it into something super productive. It can just be having a real honest conversation with yourself about what that anger is telling you, what it's pointing you towards, what unmet need it's alerting. Good anger is hard to do. It's kind of the through line between acting and not acting. There's lots of examples of bad anger in the world, and it kind of tends to happen in two different ways. There's bad anger out, which is the one we typically think of, which is someone who can't stop losing their temper. You're ranting in traffic, you're swearing at a stranger, whatever. And then there's bad anger in, which I describe as the other anger problem in the book, which is suppression, repression, turning anger against yourself. And that's when you start to get into conversations about really negative self-talk, self-harming behavior, self-destructive behavior. And this was very much for me, for most of my life, how I got anger wrong. I'd kind of turn it in on myself. My inner monologue would be very vicious and angry. So it was funny that I described myself as not an angry person. What I really meant was I wasn't showing the world my anger, but inside I was feeling a lot of it. So bad anger is sort of very easy to do in a sense. Getting anger right is a lot more difficult. It takes a lot of patience, it takes a lot of practice, it takes a lot of getting it wrong, as I've learned, and I talk about this in the book, some of the ways that I got it wrong. But if you can get anger right, it becomes this very life-enhancing emotion. So that's really what the book is about, is how you can find a way to put anger to good use. Because you can't get rid of it, we can't avoid it. The world is an anger-inducing place. It's a natural emotion to feel. So what are we going to do with this problem? We might as well try and put it to good use, and that's what the book's about.
Because ultimately, there's a reason why we get angry from an evolutionary perspective. There is some mechanism there that we've evolved with where we need it. So as you said, it's not something we're going to get rid of. The turning anger inward is definitely something I can relate to a lot. I think that I still fall into that trap. And actually, I used to I used to see it as a positive thing because I saw it as something that would push me on to do better and be better and do more and get more. But I think you definitely, and I certainly got to a point where it did become very detrimental. And so just trying to alleviate some of that is important. And I think it's an important point to talk about actually, because I feel like you said, we talk a lot about the outward anger, what we visibly see. And when we talk about anger when it comes to men, I think we automatically think of that, but I don't think we actually talk a lot about the inward anger and how men are actually angry at themselves as well, and the impact that that's having.
Yeah, I think there's a really important distinction that we have to make at the beginning of this conversation, and it particularly applies to men, I think, which is that anger and aggression and violence are very separate things. And there is an anomaly in the English language where we often use the word anger as a substitute for aggression and violence. So we take a word for a healthy emotion that is neither good nor bad. It doesn't always feel good, you know. Sometimes it can feel kind of euphoric, but it's an emotion that's neutral like any of the others. It's a core emotion that we have, one of the five. Aggression and violence is a behavioral choice, and we conflate the two all of the time. And this is really one of the reasons why anger has such a bad image problem, let's say. I think the reason anger has been left out of the mental health revolution is that it has like a dangerous, taboo, you know, transgressive reputation. And a lot of that comes back to the conflation with violence and aggression. The best way to think of it actually is that when we choose to be aggressive, that's actually a rejection of anger. It's not its ultimate expression or its most authentic voice or its endpoint or anything like that. It's actually a sign that we can't handle the anger, because what anger is telling us is that we've been hurt, that we have a need that isn't being met, that we have an insecurity, that we have a fear. This is all the information that's in anger. But when you react to it by, you know, punching a wall or kicking the cat or shouting at somebody, you're really just pushing that away. So you're pushing the wisdom of anger out of the picture and you're just reacting. So when it comes to men and anger, that's one of the misconceptions, you know, that applies to anger in general. I think it's particularly true for men because men are more prone to aggressive behavior. You only have to look at, you know, crime statistics for evidence of that. If you want to look at evidence of anger in being a male problem, you can look at the suicide issue, which is a massive problem for young men and something I've been reporting on for years. The ultimate expression of anger turned inward is suicide.
You made the point that anger is one of these topics that we're not maybe talking about as much from a mental health perspective. And I
Yes.
think probably one of the reasons for that is this narrative around toxic masculinity. Because I think when people think about toxic masculinity, one of the first things they'll think of is an act of violence, which to your point, then they'll tie automatically to anger.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that, you know, the debate around toxic masculinity is a really important one, but the one thing that we risk, it's like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. You know, if you throw anger out with the conversation around toxic masculinity as opposed to just aggression and violence, then that means we're not having a healthy conversation about anger. And it's just as important for women, by the way, of course. And actually, one of the most interesting statistics I found when I was writing the chapter about how anger is experienced differently depending on identity, and gender is a massive part of that conversation, is that actually for about the last 10 years, women report feeling more anger than men globally. So traditionally, anger has always been seen as a male emotion, which is a complete misconception. Um, Men and women have exactly the same, you know, capacity to feel anger. Something about the world recently actually means that women report feeling it more than men, but the way that we act on it tends to be a little bit different. And so when you're talking about men and anger, you really have to separate out the aggression and the violence part in order to have like a constructive conversation around it, which is what I think we need.
So how would women typically demonstrate anger? So if it's coming from a male perspective, if it's coming from something like violence, for example, how would women tend to act out on that, I guess?
So there are lots of studies going back, you know, decades and decades that suggest that women are much more prone, on average, to anger containment, which is another way of saying the anger in thing.
Mm.
So women are much more likely to turn anger in on themselves. They're much more likely to develop what's known as racket emotions. So that's when we cover one emotion that we have been given the idea that it's unacceptable to express, we cover it up with a different emotion. So a typical one for women is that they cry when they get angry. And lots of the women that I interviewed about anger actually said this. They said, when I feel myself getting angry, I then cry, and that isn't helpful to them because it kind of, it might make the person feel sorry for them, or perceive them as being weak or something like that. Actually, they're angry. But there are lots of reasons why, women often don't feel as able to express anger as men. Personal safety, sexism in the way that emotions are interpreted. So if a woman gets angry in public, she will be, there would be a dimmer view taking of that than there would be of a man being angry in public. So there's lots of social factors. There's some evidence to suggest there may be some biological differences as well. The risk modifying part of the brain is stronger in women, so they're less prone to risk taking behavior, which would include aggression and violence. So that's another factor in perhaps why women tend to contain, suppress, repress anger more than men. Men are more likely to overreact outwardly. So yeah, you have to start to untangle different layers of how identity affects the way people can express anger publicly and in society. And, race is a big factor in that as well. It's a very complicated, the more you dig into anger, the more you see it's actually a very complicated social emotion. It's not this sort of animalistic, prehistoric emotion that's just a nuisance that we've still got lingering around from, caveman times or something like that. It's actually a very complex social emotion. And it's actually one of the most verbalized as well. So when you think about what makes you angry, it's often what someone has said. When you think about how you express anger, process it, whether healthily or unhealthily, it's in conversation. Anger is incredibly entertaining. Most comedians will at least affect a stance of anger. They'll rant about something because it's kind of transgressive and entertaining. So anger is actually an incredibly linguistic, sophisticated human emotion, which is why we have to have a more nuanced conversation than the one we tend to about it.
As opposed to this idea of it being this rough and ready emotion.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Interesting. I've always thought as well, the suppression element of anger, what kind of impact that's having both physically and mentally.
Yeah, so anger, let's call it anger suppression, but we can include repression in that, is a disaster for us, physically and mentally. And let's deal with the mental first of all. So, there's a saying that many people have heard, which is depression is anger turned inward. And this has been an established principle in psychology since around 1917, when Freud first wrote about it. He looked at the difference between mourning and depression. Mourning being the healthy response to losing a loved one, depression being the state of depression, which can become a long-term problem. The difference that he found between the two was that when you're depressed, you turn anger against yourself. All the other symptoms of it is like you're mourning somebody. So self-directed anger is a major part of depression. It also has a really big role to play for many people in anxiety, which was the big revelation for me. So when I started to express anger healthily, my anxiety levels went down, because what I was doing was I was containing anger in my body and it was manifesting as anxiety. So that was my racket emotion. But there are lots of studies with sufferers of social anxiety and different anxiety conditions within the umbrella that link it to an inability to express anger. So anger has a big part to play in both depression and anxiety. The healthier we can become at expressing it, the less likely we are to suffer from those conditions. But that's before you even get on to the physical health. So if you read Gabor Mate, Bessel van der Kolk, who've both become kind of poster, figureheads of the mind-body movement in recent years. Before them, Sue Gerhardt, the psychologist who wrote a lot about child development. They have linked anger repression to everything from autoimmune diseases, inflamed nervous system, breast cancer, rheumatoid arthritis. Anger repression has been found to play a part in lots of very serious illnesses. And it really comes down to the fact that when you repress anger, it takes a terrible toll on your immune system. You're filling your body with cortisol a lot of the time. Gabor Mate refers to anger as the emotional immune system. If you can express anger, it's like an emotional immune system to be able to do that healthily. For me personally, and again, it's something I talk about in the book, I ground my teeth for years.
Mm, mm,
I'd wake up and my jaw would be aching, and it got really bad. It got to the point where dentists were worried I was going to lose my teeth because I was just grinding and grinding and grinding, and had one of those tooth guards to wear at night. And this went on for years and years, and everybody who could tell me anything about it said it was linked to stress and anxiety. And what do you do when someone tells you that, something is being caused by stress and anxiety? You get stressed and you get anxious about it, right? So I didn't see there ever being a solution to it. When I started working on anger in therapy and different areas of my life and learning to express it more, the teeth grinding stopped. My leg used to shake. You see people like that. It's often young men, I've noticed. Young men, they'll sit and their knee will be vibrating like a piston. I did that for years, particularly when I was younger. Again, when I started to work on anger, that stopped. And what I realized is that this anger containment that I was doing was kind of writing itself all across my body in different ways. It's almost like I was vibrating with this
mm.
unexpressed anger. So the link to the mental and the physical health, and repressing anger is becoming clearer and clearer. And I think that we tend to think of that link as the other one. So someone who can't stop losing their temper, they're going to give themselves a heart attack, they're going to have an ulcer, their head's going to explode. Perhaps. Or perhaps that person is actually in a healthier state than the person who never says boo to a goose, because they're containing all this anger in their body, and who knows how that's affecting them. Just because we can't see it as clearly in the street, we assume that they'd be the healthier person, but that may not be the case.
I think this just underlines the importance of having these conversations around anger and a proper education around anger. Because if you were to ask me what are some healthy ways to express anger, I wouldn't be able to tell you. I
Yeah.
wouldn't be able to tell you. I'd be able to tell you all of the negative sides and all the things that I shouldn't do. And so if you don't know a healthy way to express it, what are you going to do? You're going to internalize it because you don't know what else to do.
Yes. And when we talk about expressing anger, I think it scares people because you think it immediately
Mm,
have to get into a confrontation.
mm,
Um, and that can be the case, and sometimes that is what's required. But a lot of anger is just acknowledging it within yourself and meditating on the feeling and making space for it, and being okay with yourself that you're feeling it. It sounds sort of a bit vague and wishy-washy, but it's true. And there are actual somatic therapy techniques that you can try where you can sit and locate the anger in your body and then spread it to other parts of your body. This is an actual
mm.
tried and tested somatic therapy technique, and you grow your capacity to feel anger so that when it next comes along, you're ready for it. So even just having a conversation with yourself or the people in your immediate circles about anger, where you talk about it almost as though you would being hungry or tired or sad or whatever, normalizing the conversation around anger with the people around you, normalizing the conversation with yourself, looking for anger when it's gone missing is a really important one as well. If you're super anxious about something, there's probably something in that situation you should also be angry about, right? Nothing is only just anxiety inducing. Nothing is all your fault. There's going to be someone else to blame for something. Focus on it, feel it, like legitimize it to yourself. You don't always then have to go and have a confrontation with someone. Sometimes that can be enough. You can express anger healthily by taking the energy of it and doing something useful. I've used this example a few times recently, but if my partner and I have an argument and I'm probably in the wrong, and we've said what we have to say, but I'm still angry, what am I going to do with that scratchy energy that I've got? I can stew and scowl and stomp around, or I can go and clean the shed, and show her what a great person I am, actually. If someone at work angers you and you can't have a confrontation with them because it just wouldn't work, or how the hierarchy's arranged isn't right, or whatever, well, go and do a report that outshines them. Go and take that energy and funnel it into I'll fuck you energy. I'll show you energy. And do something that gets you ahead. So there's lots of healthy ways to use anger that doesn't necessarily mean having it out with someone. However, learning how to have it out with somebody calmly and proportionately and in the right way is a very, very powerful thing. And that is something that can help us get ahead everywhere in life, at work and at home. Probably one of the most powerful life skills you can learn, I would suggest. And it's taken me a very long time. So there's some ways that you can express anger healthily. But yes, you're right. They don't immediately spring to mind. You immediately think of the bad stuff, the kind of, getting into a fight or something like that.
You were touching there on yours and your partner's relationship. What does good anger look like generally within the context of a relationship? Because there's always going to be highs and lows. There's always going to be points where you're feeling anger maybe towards your partner, or just you're feeling angry in general and you're around your partner, and so they might be getting the shrapnel of that. How would you look at anger in the context of a healthy relationship?
Well, it's the hardest part of your life to put it in good use, I would say. Well, it has been for me anyway. It's sort of ironic, isn't it? We tend to reserve most of our anger for the people we're closest to, because they're the people that we're our truer selves around. But then the flip side to that is that they have to put up with it, and it's not always good for our relationship. And certainly bad anger in a relationship is an incredibly corrosive. And one thing I studied a lot in writing the chapter about love, anger and love, was what are the signs, according to relationship experts, that a relationship is really in trouble. And there is a pair of married researchers called the Gottmans in America,
Yes.
very famous. And they have studied this at length, and they found that one of the biggest predictors of divorce is when couples are contemptuous of each other.
Mm.
When you're expressing contempt for your partner to their face, that is really the worst of anger. You're really going for their character, and it's very toxic and negative. So bad anger is awful for a relationship, of course. I did learn some ways that you can address that, and developed a few of my own ideas about it as well, which are in the book. One thing my partner and I have found super useful is to talk about anger when we're not angry. So I call this just the anger chat. So if you can sit with your partner and have a proactive conversation around, what we've been together a while now, like these are the things that really trigger me, and I might not know fully why yet, or maybe I've got some idea, but I'm going to talk to you about it now, and these are some of the buttons that I have, and tell me about yours. And it's actually kind of an interesting, fun conversation when you're calm, right?
Mm.
What that does is it gives you a bit of a map, so that the next time you get into an argument, it's very, very hard because you lose your head a little bit, but you can get quicker to recovery because you kind of remember, oh yeah, they've got that thing, and one of the key things to learn with anger, that I always say, is kind of three things that anger is alerting us to, right? One, and the simplest, is a boundary violation. So that's when someone's banged into you in the street and you go, whoa, you step back or you defend yourself in some way. So that's a boundary violation. Second thing is an unmet need. So why is this making me so angry? It's because something is not right in my present life and is bothering me. I don't feel respected over here. I don't have someone's attention on this thing. Whatever. There's an unmet need that needs to be addressed that's behind the anger. The third, that's much harder to get to, is the wound, right? The deeper wound, the historic wound. And so what I think gets triggered a lot in relationships is wounds that go way back, because it's in the context of love and the stakes are so high and it's someone that you really care about and you're often talking about big, important things. Not always, you can fall out over the TV, but often that's there in the background. And so looking not at just what anger is telling us about other people, but what it's telling us about ourselves, what the information is for us, is really, really hard to do. But if you can do that in the context of a relationship, and you can start thinking, okay, well, what are these wounds that's being poked and prodded by something my partner has done or said? It's tough stuff, but you can start to work on things that way. And that's why, when I say anger is information, it can be a source of really profound information for you about what's really going on. So trying to get into that stuff in the context of relationship is super tough, but I think it can be done. There's some more practical stuff in the book as well about how to argue well and taking time outs and things like that are a bit more kind of practical. But yeah, it's a very difficult sphere of life to work on anger in. I mean, any emotion, I think, probably.
But I like the idea of being proactive with it and having that conversation where you're both in a good place and both feeling calm and rational, because you can really have a more logical conversation about it, as opposed to, obviously, if you're in the midst of an argument, it becomes a lot more difficult.
We get something that they call an amygdala hijack,
Mm,
which is just a fancy way of saying you've lost your temper.
yeah.
But once you've had that, you cannot formulate a rational thought. You know, you can barely speak. I'll give one little tip, actually, in a relationship, or actually in any conversation around anger. Something they call the discomfort caveat. So if I sit down with you to talk to you and I'm still angry, but I have to talk now, we have to talk now, this is the moment. I'll say to you something like, Simeon, I'm experiencing anger, and so I'm not going to be able to express myself as clearly as I'd like to. And what that does is that immediately puts us on a sort of empathic an empathic stance with each other, and you're more likely to be charitable in what I say. So it's just kind of just holding your hands up at the beginning, going, "I'm angry, and because I'm still in the midst of that anger, I'm not going to be able to be as articulate and clear or rational as I'd like to be." You know, so there's ways of kind of framing discussions that can help.
But even in that example, again, it just highlights the importance of having a proper understanding about anger. Because I think if you didn't, and you said, I'm feeling angry, I could almost see the other person switching off from everything else that you say, because they're thinking, oh, he's feeling angry. Oh, what can I expect now? And you're obviously thinking about, like, maybe a potential violent act or something like that.
Sure, and yeah, I mean, if you're speaking with someone that you think could be violent towards you, then yeah, you're not going to be understanding, and quite rightly so. Yeah, I think it works best in the context of a relationship where there's obviously already an understanding with each other. I suppose you could soften the language in a work context and be say, look, I'm upset at the moment, and so
Yeah.
bear with me. You know, you're really just asking for a little bit of empathy before you get into the stuff that you need to talk about, which I think can help. You know, just a slight reframing before you get into the nitty gritty.
Hi everyone, I want to take a moment to shout out Apex Everest, an incredible organisation and partner of the show who are pushing the limits of human resilience. Imagine this, climbing the equivalent of Mount Everest, but right here in the UK, by summiting the Helvellyn mountain 9 times in just 48 hours. But Apex isn't just about the challenge, it's the chance to be part of a year-round, vibrant community dedicated to unlocking your true potential. Whether you're looking to push your own limits or you're part of a team wanting to build an unshakable bond, this experience will stick with you for life. So if you're ready to conquer your Everest and be part of something special, check out apexeverest.com to find out more. There's a chapter in the book called Who is Allowed to be Angry? So who is allowed to be angry?
Well, we all are. We all should be. We all should feel that we are. That is the wider, the bigger point. But yeah, I mean, it comes back to some of the stuff we touched on earlier. I mean, there is a conversation I had with, and I mentioned him a couple of times in the book, a friend of mine who was an author and a poet and a very celebrated writer who's very emotionally intelligent in his work and all of those things. He's a black man in his 30s. And we had a great conversation one day about anger, and we'd had a similar journey up until a point with it. And he said that it wasn't until he went into therapy that he could even name anger. He talked about it as this like uncomfortable feeling that he had. And he was telling his therapist about it one day, and she said, "You realize you're describing anger?" And he was like, "Oh God, okay. I didn't think I ever got angry. You know, it was one of those." And so we both had reached that kind of point of realization, but it was interesting. I went down the route of like, okay, I'm going to learn how to express anger because I want to try and get better at it. He didn't feel he could do that. And even once he'd identified the problem of sort of anger suppression, because of how the world responds to him as a black man when he expresses even very mild anger, it was too it's too fraught, it's too full of risk for him to do. So that was a point where, you know, immediately I was like, okay, so our difference in identity, the racial difference between us, means that our ability to express anger is very, very different, or it's a very different calculation for me to have to make to him. Same for men and women, and they're all different kind of identity markers that can complicate that. So everybody is allowed to feel anger. It is the right idea, but the reality is very, very different. And there's no easy solution to that, or certainly not one that I have. But talking about anger more and kind of not neutralizing it, bringing the temperature of the conversation down, I think can only help that. But it's a very complicated thing.
What role does self-compassion play in being able to understand and process one's anger?
Yeah, I think a big role. Bell Hooks wrote about self-esteem, self-love. There's a small section in the book where I talk about self-love and the role that anger plays in it. And, when you think about it, anger is one of the most self-loving emotions, because really what it's saying to you is like, you're worth defending. I've got your back. And it also gives you the energy that says, you've got this. Now, it's like a friend who's too excitable and you can listen to it and get it wrong very, very easily. But at its core, anger is saying something very self-compassionate to you, which is that you are worth defending and that not everything is your fault. And that you have value, because you can't get angry on behalf of something that you don't value, right? So I think anger plays a big part in self-compassion. If you flip that, I think, a self-compassionate thing is to accept anger in yourself and not drift into feelings of shame and guilt about that, which is very, very difficult. It's tough stuff. This is not the easy end of the mental health conversation. It's not the easy, it's not the easy stuff, I don't think. But it's really, really important. And I think if you try and be self-compassionate and have no place for anger, then you're not really being fully self-compassionate. In the same way that if you have a relationship with someone who you are intimate with and who you love, and in that relationship there's no place for anger because you're both scared to admit it or you'll never tell each other, then that's not an authentic relationship, really, because you're hiding this part of yourself and they may be from you. So I think self-compassion without anger doesn't really make sense.
I love that description of anger being a self-loving emotion. I want to sit on that for a minute, because that is never a connection I would have made. But the way that you described it in terms of thinking about it from your own self-worth and you are worth defending.
Yes.
I think, yes, as you said, that can very easily tilt the wrong way, but actually in a healthy dose, I can absolutely see how that can be a self-loving emotion, as you said.
Yeah, and I think even being angry with other people is, in a sense, an expression that you value them, right? Because think of it this way: if an animal attacks you, right, that will upset you, and you'll try and get out of the way of the animal. You're not going to be angry with it because you don't see it as as a creature that can be blamed or could change or anything like that. You're just upset that you've been bitten. If you get angry with somebody like your partner and who you love, really you're getting upset because they mean so much to you that you know things could be different between you, and that you want things to be different between you. It's anger is really like a signifier of value if you listen to it in the right way, and that definitely applies to yourself.
What are some small habits that men in particular can build for themselves so they can have a healthier relationship with anger ultimately?
I think it depends where you sit on the anger in and the anger out spectrum. And what I've tried to do with the book, because there is so much written already for people with the problem of, let's say, too much anger or anger out. There are lots of tried and tested techniques and classes and things available in books for men or anybody who can't control losing their temper. So the advice I try and give in the book is a little bit more geared towards people who tend to suppress and repress. And one small technique I talk about for that is, I don't know if you ever wake up and you feel anxious straight away, almost as soon as your eyes open.
Yes. Yeah.
That still happens to me. And what I've learned to do is to always look for the anger, even when it's not apparently there. And I think of it like a teacher on a school trip checking all the pupils are there when they get off at a new stop on a train or something. Where's the anger in this situation? So if I wake up anxious about work and I'm worried about bills, and I had this conversation where I feel like maybe a person didn't like me because of it, or, what if this happens? I'm catastrophizing and all of that. I just sit for a moment and I think to myself, okay, that's how you feel right now. But if you were to feel angry, why would that be? And where is it? Almost locate it in your body. It's normally kind of below the anxiety. Anxiety's up here and it's quite shrill and insistent and, it's scratchy. And I can focus a little bit lower down in my body, often in the diaphragm, and find the kind of anger and just sit with it and give it space, humor it to begin with. When you learn to just like tune in more like that, whether it's because you're quietly meditating in the morning or you're going for a walk or whatever, when you make more space for anger, it balances your emotions out a little bit more, particularly anxiety. And I think that is one small little practice that you can get into the habit of that helps you build your relationship with anger. Basically look for it when it's not there. And I don't necessarily mean then go and act on it or do anything, just acknowledge it.
Yeah, I just wanted to be clear on what you meant by making space for it. And I think what you were saying there is just finding it and acknowledging it and just letting it be, as opposed to trying to think, I need to get rid of it, essentially.
Yeah, get rid of it, or, panic about what it's going to lead you to do. It's not going to lead you to do anything unless you decide to, right? You can just feel it. It sounds too simplistic, but for me, that took a lot of learning. So maybe to some people, that comes very easily. To me, it did not. So even being able to say to myself, oh, okay, there's some anger in the mix here. I'm actually going to dwell on that for a little while and be okay with it. Like that was something that took me a long time to learn how to do. And I think that many people are the same. And so for the anger in people, the repressors and the suppressors and the conflict avoiders and the people pleasers, just that simple exercise alone is a good one to try. Another interesting thing, going back to the body, I spoke to people who have healthy relationships with anger, and they found it in like dancing, pounding the pavement when they run at night. For me, it was boxing, which is kind of an on the nose one, but that's what worked. When you channel feelings of anger into something productive, like a physical exercise, that is another way of building a connection to yourself in your mind and your body between anger and something healthy. And this is why it's a lot better to do than smashing plates, screaming into a pillow, or that primal scream therapy stuff from the 70s that's been long debunked. That can feel for a few seconds like it's helped, but then you feel like shit because you're left with a sore throat or a smashed plate or, a pillow that's probably half torn to pieces. When you take that same energy, but you channel it into a skill that you're perfecting, which is sport, sport is a good example, or a creative pursuit, which is another thing that people do, then you're using anger productively. So building habits like that, and how you exercise and how you spend your free time is another good way.
Yeah, when you were talking about smashing the plates, I was almost thinking the analogy of like junk food. It makes you feel good for a little bit and then you just feel like terrible afterwards. Whereas doing something more productive is going to be ultimately more fulfilling in the long run. I also think I really like those examples because, again, I think the narrative of getting men to talk more, I don't think is wrong, but I think we just need to be careful that we're not making men feel that they're just limited to talking. I prefer the getting men to express more, because that includes talking, but that can include a lot of the things that you were saying there, whether that's poetry or sport or exercise or whatever it might be, because that might be the best way for you to ultimately process whatever emotion it is, be it anger or whatever it is, and do it in a way that you feel more comfortable. Because if you feel like talking is the only way and you're just not in a situation or a position where you feel comfortable or even able to do it, or you have the right people to do it with, then you can feel a little bit stuck.
I agree with you. And I think the let's talk about our emotions more thing is a good starting point for the conversation with men.
Yes.
But we need to go a little bit further with it. And we need to say, okay, well, why is talking about things good? Well, one reason is that it frees up some mental space. It frees up some energy. You are unburdened. If I was to talk to you now about something I'm worried about, I've lessened the load. And then you've got more space and energy to go and do the practical thing. And a lot of time for men, they want to engage in a solution. They want to do something that progresses their situation. Well, talking about it can be part of that, because you create the space for yourself to do it.
Mm.
And, this manifests in different people in different ways. I mean, I've always written as a way to kind of express myself. So if I'm angry, I might go for a long walk and spend the whole time in my head constructing the perfect argument, or whatever, the most righteous, expression in my head verbally of how I could address a situation. I used to live with a guy who I got talking to one day about his angers and frustrations with things, and he would just go out and fix something in his garden. That's what he did. He'd get angry and frustrated, and rather than lose his temper in the home with his kids or whatever, he'd go out into the garden and bang a hammer on something. I never really knew what he was doing, but he knew. And I understood him a lot better when I came to realize that, for him, this is how he processes his frustrations, his anger. He goes and does something practical like that. So, talking about your emotions can be a step towards the productive thing. And I think that's sometimes the bit of the message that we leave out for men. We just say to them, oh, you have to talk about your feelings. Well, not everybody feels like it, or they might be more encouraged to do so if they see it as part of a continuum of practical response.
Sam, what's one important thing relating to anger that we haven't spoken about today but really should have done?
There's a chapter in the book about online anger.
Mm.
And in a way, it's the anomaly of the book, because try though I did, I couldn't find much in the way of good anger playing out online in our online lives.
Mm.
So, nevertheless, it has become the medium by which most of us express our sort of anger, our dissatisfaction these days. And I think one thing we haven't touched on, when you look at our online spaces, they are designed to keep us around as much as possible. We've kind of figured that out. The attention economy, social media, has a single objective, and that is to keep you on it for as long as possible. Facebook and Twitter and the giants of social media figured out quite a long time ago that anger was one of the best ways to keep us there. But the way anger plays out online is that you have the expression, but you don't have the resolution. And so if you and I were to argue, this happened to me on Substack the other day, someone misinterpreted, I felt something I'd written, and then I replied to them. And because of the way those online spaces are set up, you don't ever have the good anger resolution to a conflict, which is basically where you sit down, you're honest with each other about what you're not happy about, and then you come to an agreement on how to move forward. And you gain a better insight and empathy into the other person's position. That's how anger is expressed healthily in real life. We don't get that online. You just get the first bit where you get to say what you're pissed off about. And so the internet it's almost like it's under this fog of unexpressed or not fully discharged anger. There's the anger cloud hanging over all of it. And we kind of know this because we all find it an unpleasant experience in some way. But I think realizing that online is not the place where you're going to find satisfaction with the things you're angry about is a really good thing to figure out and to change, and venting online, whichever way you look at it, and I looked at it as many ways as I could, does not do anything good for us whatsoever.
So if something makes you angry online, what would you recommend people do to help with that?
Switch off your laptop and go and do something nice. No, it's difficult, yeah, and a lot of the time it's the world making us angry. But again, you can ask yourself, well, how much of the way I'm responding to this belongs to the issue, and how much of it is symbolic of something else? How much of it is kind of about one of those unmet needs or those wounds that it might be pointing at? Might just be that you're angry at the thing. But what you're not going to get any true satisfaction from is sending that off there. Maybe you can go and join a campaign group and meet people in real life who are angry about the same thing and talk about why and funnel it into protest, or something like that. I think that would be a healthy way to take anger that can be generated by something you see online, but just lingering there in the space, kind of having a voice but not really, and transmitting it one way with nothing back, that isn't going to make you feel any better.
Sam, thank you so much for your time today. I think this is an incredibly important book. What's become really clear to me in this conversation is that we really do need to be talking more about anger and having a better understanding of it, and we need to stop demonizing and weaponizing it, and as you very rightly said, separating the core emotion that is anger from the visible things we see around violence and acting out, etc.
Mhm.
And I love when you were talking about there's a lot of wisdom in anger, and I was ruminating on that as we were talking, and I think it's very true. I think it's true for a lot of these core emotions that we have. When we dig a little deeper, it is actually trying to tell us something about, as you said, unmet needs or historical wounds or whatever it is. And so just making more time for that and really listening and trying to understand where those emotions are coming from, as opposed to just being fixated on someone acting out or some act of violence, I think is really, really important. And I think when we can start to do that, it's just going to be beneficial for everyone. So I love what you're doing with the book. We'll definitely include a link in the show notes to it, and highly recommend everyone goes out and gets it. But thank you again, Sam, for your time. It's been a really, really interesting and important chat.
Thank you. It's been great.